Hello and welcome back to Philosophy Over Tea, the podcast where you join me on my journey through philosophy. Hosted by myself, Sahir, Philosophy Over Tea will take you through major facets of philosophy, exploring major philosophers, essential texts, as well as upcoming technologies along the way. In today's episode, we take a look at a moral and political philosophy known as libertarianism. We'll take a look at what it is, how it came up, as well as some issues with it and its relevance in the world today. Welcome to Philosophy Over Tea. Now, in the previous episode, we spoke about utilitarianism, and utilitarianism was essentially the moral philosophy that attempted to maximize utility. Utility is essentially the maximizing of the balance of pleasure over pain for the most amount of people. To sum it up, utilitarianism essentially argues that the moral, just, and right thing to do is the most amount of good for the most amount of people. We took a look at a few trolley problems last week as well, and I want to revisit one of them in particular. The one that I want to revisit is where, say, 5 patients came in and each of them need a certain organ. If they don't receive that organ transplant, they are going to die. Now, in the next room over, you have a perfectly healthy gentleman who just came in for a regular checkup. You could just pop over into that room, slice his throat, take out all the organs, go back in and do the transplants. Now, those 5 would live, but you would have killed that one person to save the 5. Now, the majority of people would agree that that is the wrong thing to do. But, well, why is that? If, say, a utilitarian supporter were to say that that was wrong, they might justify it by saying that, well, in the long term, there's going to be more ramifications. In the long term, when people see that I've just used someone who just came in for a regular checkup to save 5 other people, people are going to stop coming in for checkups, and that's going to overall lead to more deaths and less utility overall. But is that really the correct reason? Looking at it from that perspective, it still seems like a really cold and distanced sort of perspective. It doesn't seem like a humane reason to avoid doing that. Another reason that's suggested why this is morally wrong is because that we should respect the individual rights of people. We should respect that that person doesn't exist just as something to be used in society. They don't just exist as a crutch to help save other people's lives. They exist as their own person, and thus they have their own rights, so we shouldn't decide for them by killing them and using them to save the 5. There's a group of moral theories that focus on this individual right, and they are known as the strong theories of rights. This group of theories essentially says that individuals matter because they are individuals. Their contribution to society doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about utility or any of the other things. What matters is that they are individual people, and thus they have different individual rights. Rights that must be respected by everyone else. Now, what we're going to be taking a look at today is known as libertarianism, which is a particular type of strong theory of rights. Now, libertarianism argues that the fundamental human right is liberty. By liberty, they mean that we should have the power to choose what we want to do. That is what liberty is. In essence, we can sum up this statement as live as you please, provided that you don't harm other people's ability to live as they please. That is essentially the mantra of libertarianism. Now, again, just like utilitarianism, on the surface, this seems to make sense. Of course, it makes sense that we should respect everyone's individual rights, we shouldn't impede on their ability, and we should let them decide what they want. But here's the thing. Libertarianism argues that the government should not interfere at all, essentially. No matter how much of an issue something is, they should never impede someone's liberty, even if it helps save the entire rest of the world. They should not impede that one person's liberty. Let's take a look at a few things that libertarianism would have an issue with that seem pretty useful in today's world. The first of these is paternalist legislation. Paternalist legislation is essentially any type of law that attempts to save people from themselves. A particular example of this would be seatbelt laws that mandate that you must wear a seatbelt when you're traveling in a car anywhere, or in a bus, or whatever mode of transportation there is. Now, in today's societies, these laws are regarded as actually pretty useful. We need seatbelt laws because, well, without them, there would be a lot more deaths around us. But the libertarianism would argue that no, it doesn't matter how much good it does, it is still unjust for the government to interfere with an individual's personal rights. They argue that it might be good to wear seatbelts for the person and for the society at large. However, it should be the individual's decision, not something that's decided and mandated by the state. If it's a state-mandated law, then that basically amounts to coercion, which means that the person does not have full rights. A particular example of this going wrong, this sort of libertarianism going wrong, is what we see with the anti-maskers going around right now, who are frankly a massive issue for everyone. They are essentially arguing that wearing a mask impedes on their individual rights, the right being liberty, and that they shouldn't be forced to wear masks in order to participate in regular things, such as go to the mall or travel in public transport. And this is where we see that the libertarianism viewpoint can be extremely harmful to society at large. A reason why I think that is because, well, libertarianism sort of assumes that people will make smart decisions. And as we've seen overwhelmingly in the past year especially, that just isn't the case anymore. People can't be relied on to make the smartest decisions for people around them. But libertarianism would still maintain that that's fine. We should allow people to do what they want to do, and that's it. Let's take a look at another type of law that libertarianism would have a massive issue with. These are known as moral legislations. So moral legislations are essentially any type of law that encourages people to act in a moral sense. It encourages people to be good, to help others. Say a law being passed that if someone was in a car accident, you are required to stop and attempt to help them, as long as, of course, there is no risk to yourself. Libertarianism would argue that as good as being moral is, it should be up to the person to decide. The government should not decide at all what is considered moral, and should not especially force it on people to be moral people. Now, this does make more sense than the previous one because it is a lot harder to categorize what moral rights actually are. So let's move on to the third type of thing that governments do nowadays that a libertarian viewpoint would call completely unjust. And this is any type of income redistribution from the rich to the poor. Income redistribution from the rich to the poor is of essentially any kind, including taxation as well. Libertarianism essentially argues that taxation is complete theft and should not be allowed in a society. But before we take a look at their argument for it, let's take a look at what makes income distribution just. Now, if we look at the income distribution in a rather inegalitarian country, say the United States of America, we say that there is a massive difference between the wealthy 1% and the bottom essentially 50% or even 80%. There's a massive difference between those. So what makes this income distribution just? Well, there's two things that someone's wealth must have in order to be just. The first of these is justice in acquisition. That means the initial holdings, the initial way that they got this, should have been done legally and in a just manner. Now, the second one of these is known as justice in transfer, in that all their wealth was attained through people buying and selling their goods willingly, and not in a coerced manner. This is why a lot of libertarians also hold that the free market is the best way to do things with minimal government intervention. They argue that subsidies should not be a thing and people should be allowed to choose willingly. Now let's take a look at their argument about why taxation and income redistribution is theft and is unjust. Well, first, libertarianisms point out that taxation is essentially taking someone's earnings. It's taking the money that they've earned through their hard work, and that's essentially what taxation is. Now, the argument continues with saying that taking someone's earnings is like taking someone's labor, someone's work. And taking someone's work is essentially forcing someone to work for you. And the time that they've worked for you, essentially, they don't get to keep that money because the money goes to the government. So what is forced labor then? Forced labor here is then slavery. And thus, through this chain of thought, they come to the conclusion that taxation is thus slavery. Now that you don't own your labor, the government is a part owner of you. And if you don't completely own yourself, then you are a slave. So according to the libertarian viewpoint, taxation is essentially just slavery with golden handcuffs, essentially. Now this leads to the fundamental moral idea of self-possession, as was suggested by Nozick, who is a major proponent of the libertarian viewpoint. Nozick argues that this idea of self-possession is where utilitarianism goes wrong, because utilitarianism assumes that people are the property of the society. People belong to the society, not to themselves. However, I would argue that full self-possession isn't a viable and benefiting option to society. Society and its constructs, such as corporations and governments, were created and continue to exist to serve the people. People don't exist to serve these corporations and governments. Libertarianism proposes an every man for themselves world, but that's not the way for humans to thrive. A civilized society is one that takes care of the sick and the poor and the elderly. It doesn't just leave them behind because, well, I own myself, you don't own me. I have no reason nor any moral obligation to help you in any way. Now, in answer to why we should care for the poor, or well, how we should care for the poor, libertarianism assumes that it is the responsibility of the people, not the government. But this also seems to say that libertarian perspectives assume that the rich will be moral enough to help. A common example of this was, well, in Athens in ancient Greece, it was considered a privilege to be the person who earned the most so that you could give back and help your society. But as we can clearly see in today's world, that isn't the case. We see people like Jeff Bezos, the current richest man alive. It is literally not worth his time to bend over and pick a $100 or $200 bill on the floor. Because, well, he simply makes more than that per second, considering how much his wealth is increasing. And I would argue that that simply isn't fair. I would say that in these cases where income is so disproportionately distributed among the population, I would say that it is the moral responsibility of the government to tax the rich and help the poor, to build infrastructure that helps the poor and increases their overall quality of life. I would argue that the existence of billionaires, while millions others suffer, is a massive failure of the societal structure put in place. Now, my viewpoint is more of a progressive philosophical viewpoint, one that assumes that it is a combination of the people's responsibility and governmental institutions to work together to help society grow and thrive. Libertarianism is one that just is a complete extreme, where it says that there should be minimal government intervention and everything should be left up to the people. I would argue that self-possession, as was mentioned earlier, doesn't have place in a civilized society. It does have place to an extent, but not to the extent that which libertarian perspectives suggest. Feel free to let me know what you guys think, either in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube, or by messaging me through the contacts mentioned in the description. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. In future episodes, we'll take a deeper look at the progressive political philosophy, as well as other branches of political and moral philosophies. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Until next time, goodbye.